Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today I wanted to show you how you can dry out your sourdough starter for long-term storage. So let's go ahead and jump into it and let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you feed your sourdough starter about 3 to 5 hours before you want to dry out your starter. That way it's at its peak, it's doubled, it's ready to go. So we're going to go ahead and feed this 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, 50 grams of fresh milled flour. I'm using my Nutri-Mill Harvest Grain Mill, and right now I have a coupon code I can share with you that will save you $20. The coupon code is GRAINY at the Nutri-Mill Bosch website. I'll put a link for that down in the description box below. There are all kinds of stories that I have heard of things happening accidentally to people's starters other than the normal contamination or forgetting to feed for too long. All kinds of things. You know, my dog ate the sourdough starter, somebody turned on the oven while it was in there being warmed, dropped it on the floor, my toddler stuck their hand in it and played with it like Play-Doh. Like, I've heard a lot of stories. So make sure you drop down in the comments below if you have a fun sourdough story also. Also, you want to make sure that your sourdough starter is nice and strong. So you want a sourdough starter that's been doubling consistently at least for a month. So you don't want to dry out a brand new sourdough starter. It will just struggle. You need something that's going to be strong enough that you can reconstitute and it's still able to turn into a new sourdough starter so that it can raise bread for you. So if you're new to sourdough and you are looking to make or start your own sourdough starter, I do have a video on that. I'll make sure to put a link in the description box below for you. I also have a blog post on that where it shows you the steps. In the video, I also make one alongside of you, brand new, so we can start that from scratch. Or if unfortunately one of these things happens to you and your sourdough starter dies before you're able to make yourself a dried backup starter, I guess. Okay, so here you can see we fed this about 5 hours ago and it's nice and doubled and strong. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this and just with a clean spoon, we're going to take this out. We want to make sure that you have this lined with parchment paper. And you need to dry it, and you'll end up wanting to store this at room temperature. But you want to make sure this is really thin and you don't have any thick areas. This should take about 24 to 48 hours to completely dry through. If it takes longer than that, then I would recommend throwing it away and starting over again, because that means it's probably either too thick or too humid. You want to put this in a place not covered where it's out of the reach from animals and kids and anything that could get into it. But you want it to be at least probably less than 1/8 of an inch thick. So I'm just trying to spread this out evenly so I don't have any major ridges or peaks or anything like that. So that I'm happy with that. You can see I'll lift this up. It's very thin on there. How you know that this is dried out completely is this will get very brittle and crumbly, and we'll be able to actually take this off and break it up into small pieces. Make sure that you're evenly spreading this. Like I said, you don't want any major like ridges or bumps or thick areas, because then this will be dry and then this will still be sticky or wet or soft, and you want it to try to dry out evenly. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this to the side, and I will bring you back in about 24 hours to show you what this looks like. Okay, so after you're done evenly spreading that on your parchment paper, you want to make sure you go ahead and feed this again so that this one's staying on my counter so I can use this tomorrow in recipes or whatever. So we're gonna go ahead and feed this again so it's ready for tomorrow. Okay, we are at 24 hours. You can see we still have quite a bit of wet left, but we've got the nice edges are starting to dry. So we'll leave it in there for a little bit longer and I'll be back. Okay, so this has now been 48 hours. You can see it's completely dried. I ended up, it kind of sticks to the parchment paper, so I gently peeled it off and I flipped it over so the other side could dry completely because it was still a little bit wet. So then I ended up accidentally breaking it. But you can see this is completely dried throughout. See that? It just kind of shatters and breaks. This is exactly what you want. So you could stick this in something and pulverize it if you want to. I just kind of break it up into small pieces. When you go to reconstitute it, you need about a tablespoon of, like, not just one of these, but like a tablespoon of pieces. And I will show you how to reconstitute this tomorrow after, so that way we have a full day that it's, you know, sat in the jar. And then we will be back to check on this. Okay, so now that it's all dry, completely all the way through, no moisture left. We don't want any moisture because that will ruin this whole thing. You want to make sure that you store this in an airtight container where no moisture or humidity can get in. So these lids have little silicone rings. That really helps. Also, you can get moisture absorbers and you could put those in here, because the key to keeping this long lasting is to keep moisture out of it. So you could also, for double safety, keep it in the freezer, which I do have one that's been in the freezer for probably 3 years now, and we're going to reconstitute some of that together to see if that is different than the one we just have air dried. I'll make sure to put in the description box below a link to these lids and the moisture absorbers that I've used in the past. Okay, so before we feed the dried sourdough, when you get this out, whenever you go to make it, you need to reconstitute it first. So I'm actually going to compare. I have this, I made from Bubbles, my whole grain sourdough starter, and I've had this in the freezer for probably 3 years or so. So I'm gonna go ahead and reconstitute that in one jar. And then this is the one we made together that we just made. I let it sit overnight and it's dry, ready to go. We'll reconstitute that in this jar and see if there's any difference between the frozen and the just shelf stable dry. So to reconstitute, I'm going to use about a tablespoon of this. Now you could definitely blend this up to be powders rather than these large chips, which okay, not 100, you don't have to have it in powder, but it may help it reconstitute quicker. So what we're going to do is take about a tablespoon. This is just an estimation. It does not have to be exact. I'm going to cover this up, stick it back on my counter so I have some for later, so you can see the amount that you do may reconstitute more than once. So we have this one. I'm gonna get a marker real quick. Okay, so I like to just use little dry erase markers. I think they do a nice job. They wipe off nice, easily, and you can just write right on the jar. Just make sure it's not wet. So we're gonna write shelf stable on this one, just so I know the difference in case somebody moves them on my counter. And then this one, I'm going to just put frozen so that I know this is from the batch that I froze. Okay, and I'm using 2 separate spoons. I mean, technically they both are from the same cultures, but it's been a long time, so I have no idea. I just don't want to cause any switch over or anything like that. Okay, so this has been frozen. I'm gonna put in about a tablespoon or so of this frozen. It took us a while to dig this out of the freezer from being in there for 3 years. Probably maybe should put it in a better container than this for long-term storage, but that's what I had at the time. So this is gonna go back in the freezer. All right, so I have the one labeled frozen, the one labeled shelf stable. You wanna make sure you're not using chlorinated water, treated water, or softened water. So I just like to use spring water. That way I know it doesn't have any contaminations or anything like that in it. So I'm just going to use this. Water changes as we travel around and I just never know. So this is the safest way for me to do it. So I'm going to do about a tablespoon of water in both of these to reconstitute this, because obviously we can't feed it right now. This has been all dried out. So this takes somewhere between 2 and 4 hours on average. I'm just going to make sure it's completely coated in the water. Spread it out basically. So that it is all sitting in the water. I don't want anything to be sitting on top. And then maybe every hour or half hour you go and mix this around. Okay, all right, then I'm gonna go ahead and pop the lids on. We don't want this to necessarily be airtight, but we wanna make sure that no dust, debris, or flies, critters, anything like that can get into it. And then I'm just gonna leave these room temperature. Like I said, 3 to 4 hours. You can maybe come and just kind of give it a little shake every half hour or hour, you know, not set to the time, but just to make sure that it's all coated in the water so it can start absorbing that, and then we can feed it. So I'll be back when it's time to feed. Okay, now that it's been 4 to 5 hours or so, both of these are pretty well reconstituted. So what I want to do is do just a regular 1:1:1 ratio feeding. I'm making sure to zero out my scale, and I weighed out in my jar. What I did was I took an empty jar of the same jar, I weighed it, zeroed it out, and then I weighed my filled jar so I knew how much I had. So both of them have about 25 grams of already reconstituted in there, what we added. So I'm gonna go ahead and mill 50 grams so that I can do 25 in one jar and 25 in another jar. I already went a little over. I'm using hard white wheat. If you have questions or struggling or need to troubleshoot your existing sourdough starter, I do have a how to make your own sourdough starter video I think I mentioned earlier, and it goes over all of the things that can go wrong and some of the things that you might encounter. Those are the same things that we could find while we're reactivating our starter. So I'm going to go ahead and take this on over to my mill. Okay, now that we have our fresh milled flour, now when you're reconstituting yours, you're probably going to only be doing one. So you just want to mill enough flour to do the same amount of sourdough starter. So in this case, we're doing 25 grams of starter, 25 grams of flour, 25 grams of water. This is my shelf stable one. So this is the one we dried together. And you can see it's pretty well reconstituted. So what I'm gonna do for this, normally I would pour this out, do it all in a bowl and put it in a clean jar, but since we just did this today, we should be good to go. So I'm going to go on here and add in about 25 grams of flour. And I zeroed that out so I knew how much I was adding. A little over, that's okay. That shouldn't be an issue. Okay, and then I'm gonna clear that out and add 25 grams of the spring water. You could pre-measure this so that you would have exact and you wouldn't have to worry about possibly going over or under. So I'm trying to just match that amount. And then I'm just gonna give this a nice stir, trying to not contaminate anything. So we've reconstituted and now we're giving it a feeding. So we will see how long it takes for this to be activated again, as opposed to our one that has been frozen for about 3 years. Okay, so it's still marked. I'm gonna go ahead, put that lid on, but not tight so that it can breathe. And I'm gonna take my little marker here and just mark on the side here so I can see how high up, keeping an eye out for growth. Okay, so let's do the exact same thing to our frozen one. You can see it's pretty well reconstituted. Alrighty, let's go ahead. I zeroed out my scale. Let's add in 25 grams of flour. Hopefully I saved myself enough. Let's go ahead and use the rest of it. Okay, 24 grams. I'm going to zero that out and go with 25 grams of water. And then we're going to mix this one up the same way, trying to not contaminate, making sure that all the dry flour is mixed throughout. But if you are making a dried starter and reactivating it, chances are you probably already know the routine maintenance of taking care of your sourdough starter, because otherwise you wouldn't be at this point if you did not have one. I guess you could have one from a friend or relative or something like that, I suppose. We're going to put that lid on there loosely. And I'm just going to put a little mark on my jar, keeping an eye out for growth. I'll check on these in about 12 hours. If I see any growth, I will let you know. If not, then we'll check on it in 24 hours and check for the growth. I will let you know what we come up with. So after 12 hours, this is our shelf stable. We can see bubbles. It's already ready to go. And our frozen one, not quite yet, but I do have some hooch on the top, which means it's trying to do something. So today we'll go ahead and feed them and then check them out later. Okay, so now we're on day 3 of our dehydrated, reconstituted, and then refeeding. So they've been reconstituted and fed day 1, and then I have fed them again day 2. So this is day 3. They've both grown. The frozen one definitely took a little bit longer. I'd say probably 1 extra day than the dried, but I don't know if it's a fair comparison because this was only dried for like 24 hours and this one has been frozen for 3 days, or 3 years. But as you can see, they both have nice bubbles and growing. From now on, you would just continue to feed them as you normally would, and I would feel comfortable to bake with, probably feed these today and bake with them tomorrow. They could both be used for discard recipes. If you notice, I did go ahead and switch from using the upside down lid to some fabric. I'm gonna start doing that with my regular sourdough starter as well. I just feel like it lets it breathe a little bit better than this upside down lid. So that's just kind of an update. If you've done any of my sourdough videos before, it's not that this doesn't work, but I think this works just a little bit better. So just wanted to let you know that update. Thanks so much for hanging out with me the last few days here while we dried and made our sourdough starter for long-term storage. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And thanks for stopping by Grains in Small Places. Goodbye.